Well, thanks very much, first for the invitation to speak today, and to Jim for those very kind words. So my talk today it concerns the wide disparities in income per capita across the world. So just to set the stage, let me show you some basic numbers, some basic facts. In this table, what I'm reporting is GDP per capita across countries relative to the United States. In every period, countries are ranked by their position in the income distribution in each period. Okay, and what I have is the average of deciles for each year. Okay, so decile 1 will be the poorest countries. They're about, in 1960, will be about 3% of the GDP per capita of the United States, while the richest countries in average will be about 80% of the GDP per capita of the United States in 1960. So what I want you to take away from this table is this very well-known fact in development that the disparities are just enormous at any point in time that you look at it. So in 1960, the ratio of average incomes between the richest 10% of the countries and the poorest 10% of the countries will be a factor of 23-fold. And more like 50-fold when you look at the years, more recent years. Now, there's also a lot of movements of countries in this disparity. It's not so apparent from the table, but I should say that the other interesting fact is that even countries in the middle of the income distribution, when you look at decile 5, we're talking about differences in income that are still pretty large. So even if you don't focus just on the very extremes of the poor and the rich, these disparities are very large everywhere, factors of 10 or 5 in the middle of the income distribution. So to look at those movements of countries over time, what I've done here is report some countries, some arbitrary set of countries that kind of illustrates a couple of points. These countries are ranked by the GDP per capita relative to the United States in 1960, and then it kind of tracks the evolution over time, okay? And so what you can see is another well-known fact in development, and is that, which I think is a positive fact, that the position of these countries in the income distribution does not predetermine whether they succeed or fail in terms of their growth prospect. You see successes and failures everywhere throughout the income distribution, and I chose these countries just to emphasize that. So you have situations like Botswana that have a remarkable episode of catch-up from about 2% of GDP per capita of the United States in 1960 to about 30% in more recent years. And at the same time that within the same kind of relative income group, you have failures like Ethiopia and Malawi, countries that are at the same point of the income distribution, yet they don't catch up. You have success episodes of Indonesia, China, India. I guess those are the more talk about, the remarkable growth in Korea, and Singapore, at the same time that you have countries within that income distribution that fail, like Zimbabwe. You have episodes of convergence with stagnation, like in Japan, and that contrasts with just stagnation in Mexico. And even among the countries at the top of the income distribution, you have a wide variety of experiences. Austria, remarkable catch-up. In France, somewhat less remarkable, but still common to many other European countries. At the same time, you have somewhat stagnation in United Kingdom, and then decline in New Zealand. I didn't put Canada, but Canada is either stagnation or decline, depends on exactly when you look at it. And so my talk today will really have 4 parts that I want to go through. The first thing that I want to do is to argue that these big differences in income across countries are mainly accounted for by productivity. And so I'm going to kind of narrow my search in terms of thinking about productivity differences across countries. And then I'm going to describe a very simple framework that is going to allow us to characterize the kind of things that the literature has put forward to understand these big productivity gaps across countries. And so I'm going to try to describe them in terms of technology, selection, and misallocation. It's going to be the big component I'll discuss. And I'll make specific these terms as I go on with that framework. Then I'm going to talk about, I'm going to dwell into the specific of the misallocation aspect. And I'm going to try to give you a sense of what are the causes of the misallocation and what are the productivity, aggregate productivity effects of misallocation. And then in the last point, and I think it's the most important point, so hopefully I'll have enough time to get there, will be to think about the more recent work on misallocation, which is this idea that connecting the policies or institutions that lead to misallocation in a very static sense, that lead to effects through what I call here selection and technology. That is, effects that are kind of more dynamic in nature, okay? And this is going to be very important because it really, this connection is going to be essential in making kind of the things that we think about creating misallocation really helping us understand bigger effects in terms of income differences or having a better chance of accounting the enormous gaps in income I just showed you. Now, I emphasize these big disparities in income across countries, and then I show you some variation over time. In a sense, understanding the changes over time is less of a hurdle than the big differences in income. So I'm going to focus really about how the literature has addressed differences in income at a point in time. And I'll describe a couple of examples where some reforms or some changes in policies or institutions help us understand the changes over time. But of course, even though I'm going to make that emphasis, many times there are many things we can learn about the policies or institutions that lead to changes over time that will help us build up and understand the very large differences in income. Okay. And so just from an accounting perspective, the first question is what is behind this very large income difference? It could be that countries differ in amount of hours or labor inputs they put in the production process. Maybe that they accumulate different amounts of capital, whether physical capital or human capital. And depending on how much action you get from these potential sources, that would determine whether we focus on aspects that relate to kind of accumulation of inputs or the decision of input allocation, or whether we think about productivity. And this is perhaps one of the very few situations in which economists sort of agree. So there is a consensus in the literature that you know, the overwhelming driver of these differences in income, at least at the aggregate level, is productivity. And so this was established by many people, obviously, but Kleiner, Rodriguez-Claret were one of the very forceful ones. And more recently, Jones has a handbook of macroeconomics where kind of reviews this evidence with more recent data. Now, a big issue in terms of establishing this relationship between total factor productivity, or some measure of productivity at the aggregate level, and income differences is the idea that we don't measure technology directly. So it's often backed out as a residual. And what that means is that any factors that we miss in terms of our accounting is going to be embedded in this measure of TFP. And so the big one there, the elephant in the room when people do these exercises, is how we measure human capital or the quality of the workers in explaining productivity differences. So I should say that there's a lot of work that has been done. I'm not going to talk about that. In terms of kind of extending the simple accounting by allowing for human capital. And the main conclusion does not really change. And the reason for why this happens is that human capital ends up accounting for a big chunk of the income differences, but you need to think about what are the drivers of those human capital differences. So to the extent that TFP is one of the big drivers of human capital differences, then in the end, we're back to trying to understand productivity differences. So here's a summary table of Jones using recent data for 2010, where he decomposed GDP per capita into different sources. He goes further and just focuses on output per worker as a measure of labor productivity. The idea is that hours of work or the employment population ratios, in fact, will go the other way. Poor countries tend to have more labor input. So the idea is what explains this variation across these countries, enormous variation in output per worker. And in this table, what he does is kind of report the best numbers we have for capital measures of capital across countries. Here is the capital intensity measure as the capital output ratio, which is a measure of kind of the contribution of capital accumulation in the production process. There's a measure of human capital, and then there's the residual TFP, and then the last column is the contribution of TFP to the income differences. And what you can see is that the overwhelming contributor to these big disparities in labor productivity is the TFP factor. Okay. So that narrows our search in terms of, obviously, we can, many of these other factors could be linked to TFP in a more complete model. But so what I'm going to do is just focus on what factors can lead to TFP gaps across countries. That's the goal. And so to understand the potential sources, what I'm going to do is describe a very simple framework that will help us guide through the different points that the literature has made on this. Now, I should say at the outset that one big explanation for these productivity differences would be that poor countries are just slow in adopting the most advanced technologies or the best practices, and that certainly when you travel to poor countries, that is easy to see. That is an explanation that certainly has some power. Now, another distinct but complementary explanation, and it's going to be a big focus of what I will talk today, is that the resources that the country has at its disposal, which may be lower than in rich countries, the idea is that these resources are not allocated in the best possible way. In particular, they're not allocated across heterogeneous producers in a way that kind of depresses productivity. And this is what the literature refers to misallocation. I'll be more specific in a second. Okay? And so, this, I'm going to draw on the simple framework that I'm going to describe to you. It's going to draw from a recent article I wrote with Richard Rogerson that is going to come out in the Journal of Economic Perspective. And it's kind of a background reading of my talk today. So let's think about a situation where, so we need a framework that help us account for the fact that it may be that poor countries simply just don't adopt the better technology, so that should be part of the environment. At the same time, that if we want to talk about misallocation, about factors not allocated to the best uses in the economy, then we need to consider production heterogeneity. Okay, so my simple framework will have those two key ingredients. So imagine for a second that there's a single good in this economy. So it's going to be a very static setting. With that, we pretty much can describe a big chunk of the literature. So there's a single good that in every period is produced by a potential number of producers. Okay? And these producers are going to be heterogeneous in one dimension. They're going to be heterogeneous in their total factor productivity. Now, output for this producer, so the amount of output of this single good that is produced by each producer, is going to be described by this production function that has the total factor productivity term, and then the labor input that I denote by H. And you see the gamma there. So it's going to be decreasing returns to scale to labor input. So the main driver of differences across these producers is going to be the A. And this gamma is going to measure the extent to which there is decreasing returns at the establishment level. I should say two things before we go on. One is that, so two key assumptions that seem arbitrary here. will be that all producers are producing the same good, and that they are decreasing returns to scale to production. None of these assumptions are really essential for what I'm going to say. So we consider a technology that has many more inputs, capital, materials, other intermediate inputs. So think about the labor here as standing by a broader composite input. It also does depend on decreasing returns to scale. One thing to view it is that the aggregate production function that comes out from this structure will be constant returns to scale when you endogenize the number of producers that operate in the economy. So this pretty much is consistent with our tradition in macroeconomics, where the aggregate production function is constant returns to scale. And then in terms of whether we have a single good or we want to characterize map the model to the data to many producers of different goods, many papers in this literature have considered an alternative framework where instead of having decreasing returns to scale in the production function with one single good, you have a variety of goods that is produced by producers that have constant returns to scale, but the curvature is on the preferences. So what determines how many of these goods are consumed is some sort of curvature in the preference for consumers in terms of the variety of goods. So none of those items will really matter, but from an illustration perspective, this way is going to help me characterize the main points in a simple way. And so what happens here is that given this structure, it is not optimal to have all the factors of production, in this case labor, into the most productive producer. And this is the critical assumption here is that this decreasing returns to scale. So the marginal product of labor is just falling as you allocate more inputs into this producer. So this is going to generate a degenerate distribution of producers, or a degenerate distribution of firm sizes, which is consistent with what we see in the data. There is also a fixed cost of operation, which I did not here C in units of output. And the main idea is that what this is going to generate is that maybe not all producers would, not all these potential producers would operate. It may not be optimal for all of them to operate. So that's it. That's the main framework that we need to kind of think about the potential channels. Now to start, let me just describe, maybe it's obvious to you from this setup what the best this economy can do, but just to be specific, let me describe it. What is the best this economy can do? And here the narrow concept will be how much output can be produced in the economy given aggregate resources, the set of firms that they are, and the amount of labor. And so I'm going to consider the allocation of labor across these producers that maximizes aggregate output net of operating costs. And the solution to this is very simple to describe. So given the aggregate amount of resources, there's going to be a threshold productivity for which establishments below that threshold, it will be optimal for them not to operate, and above, they would operate. And then among the producers that operate, the allocation of labor is going to be increasing in the productivity of the establishment. Okay? And in fact, if I have two establishments with the same productivity, this establishment should operate of the same size. To produce the same productivity, they produce the same good, they should operate at the same size according to the efficient allocation. Now, this efficient allocation may never be achieved in practice. It's not like, there are many reasons for why an economy may not want to have this allocation. There may be other benefits, but from the perspective of understanding what are the costs of some alternative policies or some different allocations, it is instructive to have something like this as a benchmark to assess the extent to which different allocations or actual allocations are driving productivity gaps or cost. Okay. So here's a stylized view of that allocation. As I just described, what I have is TFP at the establishment level and the amount of input, and these are in logs because this relationship is very nonlinear. And so what you see is that it's going to be some threshold. Here is arbitrary at this point. But so these producers will get assigned no labor, so they don't operate. and then there's an increasing relationship of labor as productivity increases on the establishment. Now, this helps us characterize misallocation in a simple way before I kind of show you some evidence or some studies. And so let me do this also in a stylized way. So now I put some artificial data I just come up with. And so what I have is this efficient allocation. I have some distribution of establishments across this productivity spectrum. And here I just put data. Okay? And what I created is some data for which, for each productivity type, I'm going to have two types of establishment, or two establishments of each productivity type, one with low employment and one with high employment, all the way throughout. So what we can see is that one type of misallocation that we're going to have in this economy is the fact that whereas in the efficient allocation, all establishments should be of the same size, what we have is systematically establishments different of size. And this is what we call misallocation within productivity types. And it's going to be important in characterizing the data because there's a lot of evidence that things like this happen. So when people think about state-owned enterprises, usually these are associated, these are establishments that are not very high productivity, but they are very big because they get subsidized credit from the government, or they are financed through government budgets. And so you can see that this type of situation is there. People call this rank reversals, because you have situations where you have productive units that are small, and then you have unproductive units that are large. Okay, so their rank in terms of the size distribution is reversed. We see another type of misallocation in here that relates to the systematic reallocation of labor across productivity types. So whereas in the efficient allocation, you should allocate more resources, more labor to the more productive establishments relative to the low productivity establishments. In this artificial data, what I have is that the average size across the productivity types is just flat with respect to, it's independent of productivity. Now there's a third source of misallocation that is a special one here that I'll mention throughout the talk. And we call this selection, but in a way, this is a special case of misallocation because you have this situation where you should have zero inputs into these low productivity producers, yet in the data we have them operating. So we have very low productivity establishments operating in this artificial economy. And then we have some very productive establishments who are not operating, don't appear in our data. Now, this is, it's nice to see it in this characterization because sometimes we go to think about these issues of misallocation through a model in which the model may have has some structure, so we are able to characterize misallocation, selection as a special case, and other factors. But if we're just thinking of misallocation from the data, then you're going to get a perspective that is limited to the misallocation of the first two types of misallocation I talk about because you focus on the data you see. It's hard to imagine without more structure, what is it that you don't see or what is it that you shouldn't see in your data, like these producers that shouldn't be in your data and these producers that should be in your data with a lot of inputs. Okay. And so to take a stock, there's really three channels that could help us understand these differences in productivity across countries. So imagine, obviously, countries differ in many dimensions. So the way that we typically do this is that you control for the aggregate resources. Okay? Think of this counterfactual as holding the aggregate amount of resources. The three channels that we have in this simple framework to account for TFP differences across countries is that the first one is what we talk about, this technology gap. So it might be that simply the distribution of producers that you have in this economy is very different, okay? They just utilize different technologies. So that will reflect, I call that technology, and that will reflect in the simple framework as differences in the distribution of the AIs that we have, okay? Now, it may be that even if you have the same distribution of productive units, potential productive units, It may be that countries choose different producers to operate, just as my example in this stylized misallocation. So we can call that selection. And then finally, it may be that even if you have the same distribution of productive units in the economy, and that you have the same productive units operating, okay, so the kind of technology set that is operating in this economy is exactly the same. Then it may be that the countries allocate the factors of production differently, just like in my two types of misallocation I showed you earlier, okay? And we call that misallocation. So my focus is going to be to review this misallocation in great detail. That has been the focus in the literature. But an important point that I hope I'll get across towards the end is that really this study, getting inside this misallocation, opens up a huge box of possibilities in terms of the type of institutions or policies that generate these type of effects. But in order for them to matter for the aggregate productivity, we need to go beyond this static misallocation and think about how those same policies that generate the misallocation are going to be affecting these other channels I talk about, either through selection or through technology. And so hopefully my last point is going to be about making that connection. And so how important is misallocation? So that's the kind of narrow question that I'm going to focus now. How important is misallocation as a way of understanding productivity gaps? So my earlier paper with Richard Royerson kind of focused on this question. So what we did was to kind of embed the standard neoclassical growth model with production heterogeneity so we could think about the allocation of resources as being an important factor, okay? And in there, we had no selection effects, so that precisely the focus on that framework was to think about misallocation in the very narrow sense I talked about in my last slide, okay? Now, what are the potential things that could generate misallocation? Sometimes we forget about these issues, that to rationalize this type of data, the fact that producers with the same productivity are choosing, or in some sort of equilibrium version of a model, will be choosing different inputs. So it has to be that they are facing different prices, either for their outputs or for the inputs, and whether it is effectively or explicitly through some policy. But we need to take away anything that affects all producers in the economy. It's not going to lead to these patterns. And that kind of limits the set of, so on the one hand, it really opens up the box, because if you focus on a representative firm, like we've done for many, many years when we focus on the neoclassical growth model, constant returns to scale, aggregate production function, then we are limited to thinking about barriers to technology adoption that are the same for all producers, barriers to capital accumulation that are the same across all producers. And those are a limited set of institutions. Instead here, what we need are institutions that may be common for all producers, but affect them differently in some effective way. And that opens up the set of institutions we can consider. But that's critical. So if you put a tax on the return to capital that is the same across all producers, this is going to have an effect on the aggregate amount of capital this economy has, but it's not going to create misallocation in the sense that it's going to have factors of production be different across producers. So this is why in the paper with Richard Royerson, we call these distortions idiosyncratic distortions, just to emphasize that this is not something that affects an industry or the entire economy, but is specific to the producer. And as I'll discuss, many of these policies are really maybe effective. So it may be that the regulation or the policy is not intended to have different effects. It's common to all producers, but effectively applied to more heavily to some producers than others. So what I've done here is write these policy distortions. This tau is going to be a wedge. And it's going to be standing in for many things. I'll discuss what they could be. But I'm going to allow these wedges to be potentially related to productivity. So you see that there is a theta I. So it may be that if this elasticity is positive, the distortions are going to be correlated to productivity. So are going to be taxing more heavily the more productive producers. Or it may be that these are just random variations, so I'm going to allow that, that epsilon term to have some noise, okay? And so I'm going to parameterize that as a log normal distributed variable. So really, I'm going to have two parameters that are going to characterize policy distortions. It's going to be the theta, which is going to tell me whether distortions are going to be correlated or not to productivity, and then the extent to which I have these random distortions. Okay? Both of them are going to generate misallocation, and so we want to see how their effects are. So think about calibrating this economy, like we did in the paper, to a benchmark economy. Maybe not an economy that is distortion-free, but the idea is that this may be an economy that is less distorted than poor economies. And the key there is to use that economy to kind of calibrate the productivity distribution, which is going to be essential in terms of putting discipline to the extent to which you can misallocate resources across these producers. And then we're going to study the impact of these distortions, either by setting correlated distortions or uncorrelated distortions or both, okay, in terms of TFP. So what I've done here is that for each economy which is going to be identical to the benchmark economy, same productivity distribution, same operating producers, same technology everywhere, except these taus, okay, which are going to reallocate resources across producers. And that's going to be characterized by these two parameters. And I'm going to report the ratio of the output of the benchmark economy, and in this case, this benchmark economy is a non-distorted economy, so this is going to be the efficient output, relative to the output of this distorted economy, okay? And I do that for several combinations of theta and combinations for those random distortions, okay? So what, although the numbers are different from what we report in the article with Rogerson, mainly because in here I have characterized these distortions in a much more general way, which I think, given that what we learn is it's useful. But the message is the same. So basically what you see is that uncorrelated distortions generate drops in TFP. Okay, the distorted economy gets lower amounts of output than TFP. But the scope of that is somewhat limited, okay? About drops of about 23% in productivity. Now, if the distortions are instead correlated, the potential productivity losses are much larger, okay? Almost 50%. Now, behind this is not the fact that correlated is special, but the idea is that correlated distortion, what it does is that they reallocate way more resources. So in a way, they are more distortive than the uncorrelated distortions. And the nice thing about this is that we can consider both correlated distortions and uncorrelated distortions, and you generate big drops in output, so a factor of a third. And so here, I'm plotting this economy. So the economy where I have a very high elasticity of the distortions to productivity, which kind of flattens the relationship between the labor input and TFP, and some random distortions at the same time. So this economy, I'm plotting the implied allocation that comes out of that. Because many times when we talk about misallocation, you may get some summary statistic about the productivity impact, or some measure of how much the marginal products are deviating from optimal or something like that. But here is, I think, is a very illustrative way of thinking about what's happening with this allocation. And so what you see here is that the blue dots are the data, the simulated data generated by that economy, of the distorted economy. And the red line will be what the optimal allocation will be. What the optimal allocation will be that efficient economy, okay? And so what you see is that we have exactly the kind of misallocation, the two kinds of misallocation I talked about earlier in my stylized example, except that in here I have all producers producing. Okay, there's no selection. Now, this is, of course, hypothetical, and the question is, do we see anything in the data that resembles this type of crazy allocation? And so I'll discuss more in detail the institutional context for this example, but here's one that, of course, I came up with the simulated economy just to replicate this type of evidence. But here's the allocation of land among farmers in Malawi. Okay, similar picture. So we have farm TFP in logs and the land size or the land input that is operated by these farmers. And what you see is it's a very similar picture. The blue dots are the data from a very, very detailed micro data of farmers in Malawi. And you get exactly this pattern of the two patterns of misallocation I talked about earlier. So interestingly, that even though the calibrated economies are very different, so the distribution of TFP among these farmers in Malawi is very different from what I calibrated for the benchmark economy before. When you do the reallocation, so you move the blue dots into the red dots here and ask how much agricultural output could go up, the answer in this article will be an increase of a factor of 3.4-fold. So very close to the factor of 2.7 I showed you earlier. And so this was done in this article with Raul Santalaria Lopez. And of course, here the critical issue is how to go from the micro data and really estimate these farm productivities. There's a lot of assumptions, a lot of data issues that go into doing that. But the striking thing is that the pattern that emerges is very similar to this misallocation. And in fact, you can connect this to the institutions of the land market that are in place in many of these poor countries. I'll talk more about it as I go on. So how we can, of course, this is an example from Malawi, and the question is this generalizable? How do we see this in other places? And so we need to kind of broaden the scope in terms of searching for evidence of misallocation. And so an important insight of this framework is that the condition that shows you how output is maximized in this economy requires that the marginal product of labor be equated across all producers. Okay, so if you forget about this distortion for now, what you see is that in the efficient allocation, the marginal product of labor should equate a price. This may, in efficient allocation will be a shadow cost. In a competitive economy will be a common wage. Now, of course, part of what's happening is that there may be a wedge in this cost, precisely induced by something like the distortions we talk about. And so the value of the marginal output is equated, but this value is distorted by whatever policies or institutions are creating that. Okay? But if you think about this framework and you look at either the marginal product or the average product, and here I'm just focusing on the average product, what we know is that in this simple framework, same producers should be equated across producers. And so this is what the literature has called, or some version of this, they call the revenue productivity, because the idea is that these should be equated. Now, of course, revenue in the sense that, this may be, if you have more inputs, you may have wedges that are different for the different inputs, okay? But they can be aggregated into something that looks like this, okay? Now, notice that sometimes it's counterintuitive to think about this object, but you may think, well, you have producers who are way more productive than others, so somehow that should reflect in the labor productivity of this producer. But in here, no. Precisely the fact that they are more productive, the way to maximize their contribution to output will be that more inputs are allocated there. Of course, because of decreasing returns to scale, the amount of output is increasing at a decreasing rate. So the marginal product or the average product is falling for the producers that are growing in size, and vice versa for the ones that are falling. Okay, and more importantly, so if we had data on this, I'm trivializing this because this is only labor here, but you can see that something about TFPR is going to be proportional, because these objects here, gamma and W, are going to be constant. You can see that it will give us an idea of these wedges, okay? And so this really sets up the stage for two ways of dealing with this kind of finding evidence for misallocation. One will be indirect, because just inspecting of this, you can say, well, if I had data on outputs or revenues or something like that to the inputs, then I can just check if there is dispersion in that object. And if there is dispersion, according to this framework, that would be evidence of misallocation. Alternatively, to the extent that something like this is related to these wedges, I could then go into the details of the institutions or the policies that will directly give me measures of the taus, okay? And then use some framework to see how those taus may derive in productivity gaps, okay? So those are, we call this type of approaches indirect and direct. Of course, there's also things in the middle, okay? But one thing that is going to come out is that there's an important distinction to be made between kind of the evidence of misallocation, which is really about dispersion in these marginal products, and then the consequences of that misallocation, okay? Which is going to be what's the productivity loss or the reallocation gain that you can obtain if you move to an efficient allocation. And those things are not, they don't map one-to-one, okay? The productivity, the aggregate productivity impact is going to depend not just on the extent of misallocation in the economy, but also on the dispersion of productivities that you face in that economy. And more generally, it's going to depend on the joint distribution, okay? So I'm going to make that point throughout. And so what is some of the evidence that we have for misallocation? So I think the best well-known paper in this indirect approach will be Xie and Clino, who simply went to, exactly as I described, went through the microdata for countries like China, India, and the United States, and kind of come up with measures of dispersion on this object, TFPR. And then what they found is, not surprisingly, substantial losses of productivity caused by misallocation. So here I have the two measures. This will be like the measure of misallocation in the sense of dispersion. Here is characterized as the standard deviation of the log of TFPR across these plants in the manufacturing sector. And then this will be the associated TFP gains of kind of reallocating resources to the best use in that economy, okay? And so now the other thing is that even in the US, you see substantial dispersion. And so one approach they had was to think about reallocation of resources in this economy relative to the US as a way of thinking that maybe there's part of this dispersion that may be related to misspecification or to measurement error. But the gains are very large. Now here I wanted to make the point that the productivity dispersion matters. So just characterizing dispersion in marginal products is not enough to say that misallocation is important. See, it really will depend on the productivity distribution. So you have India for 2 years for which in principle, the dispersion in TFPR is the same, yet the gains from reallocation are different. And part of what's behind here is that the relationship of TFP and TFPR are changing. Or you have a situation like more dispersion in China than, let's say, India in '94, and yet the reallocation gains are higher in India. Okay? So behind this is the fact that the distributions of productivities across time or across countries differs. So here's a plot of the distributions of TFP at the establishment level for 3 countries, the US, China, and India, in the Xie and Clino sample. And what you see is a huge variation. Let's say the more remarkable is between India and the US. And here, China, the small firms are not well represented. So perhaps the fact that China and the US are so close to each other is a sample selection issue. So it is important then to not only find evidence of misallocation, but it's going to be important to understand that potentially this productivity, this misallocation may be related to these shifts in the distribution. In my simple example earlier, you can see how all the time you're going to have firms represented from the lower end of the productivity distribution because of selection. That may be one channel. Or it may be that the entire distribution is shifted because of technology choices. So we need to explore that. Now, there's evidence of this misallocation from many other countries. So because I'm running out of time, I'm going to skip. But this has been done for many, many countries. I think one great aspect is that microdata has increasingly become available, and that has helped a lot. Now, the main issue with this approach is that even though it's very useful as an accounting exercise of giving you an overall sense of the importance of misallocation, or maybe identifying where the misallocation may be, because misallocation may be across producers within a same industry, maybe across industries, maybe across occupations, maybe across cultural states, or maybe across other factors. And this is a device that helps us kind of see where the misallocation may be occurring. And this could be changing across time or across space. But the main limitation is that this is really silent about the source of the misallocation. And understanding why this misallocation is created is critical in terms of policy analysis or institutional development. Now, of course, in addition to this, measurement is a big issue. I put 4 things here that the literature has tried to deal with. When you think about plant level data, so I made a very simple mapping with things, but when you want to take your model to the data, you have to deal with lots of things. Sample selection, do we have similar samples across the countries? Is the sample representative of the firms in the country and the sector? Now, another issue is that for many of these plants in the production setting, what you have is revenue. So you need additional, I didn't have that problem here because I assumed the same producers of the same good, different producers of the same good. But in general, you have revenues, and you need to somehow have additional structure to separate price and quantities, okay? Now, of course, then you may have evidence from other sectors or from data that explicitly has plant-specific deflator, or other sectors like agriculture where you actually have data reported in quantities, and you can evaluate the extent to which this is important or not. Particularly, the data I show you for Malawi, that's based on quantity, so it doesn't require this assumption. The specification of production structure is also important. I mean, in a way, I left that gamma to be constant hanging in there, and I drop it as I take the log of TFPR. But obviously, with enough production heterogeneity, you can account for a lot of these variations. So there's some restriction that needs to be made about the production structure. The inputs and outputs may be measured with error, and in the manufacturing data, this is an issue. Lots of the time, you have capital, which is measured as book value. So that's representing a lot of variation in their productivity, which is not captured by the data. Now, not only we have increasing data availability, we also have now panel data. So some of these issues have been dealt with exploiting the panel dimension to control for measurement error and such. And so recent work by Bills, Klina, and Rand have done that. And so measurement error is important, although the main conclusions are really not changed. You may have adjustment costs. So a lot of this variation in marginal products may be due to the fact that these transitory shocks and the firms have some cost in adjusting their inputs. Again, the right way to deal with this would be to embed this alternative hypothesis like distortions or adjustment costs, and then have some way to disentangle. So David and Venki, what they do is they exploit the panel dimension of these data sets to kind of separate what's dispersion caused by adjustment costs versus dispersion in policy distortions. And again, the conclusion is that overwhelmingly, something like policy distortions will be the main driver. Now, not that these issues are not important, but I think these are common issues in many applied work. And so, and ultimately, I don't think you would ever come up with an answer that people will be completely happy in terms of the measurement. But my perspective here is that really the main limitation of this approach is that there's so far we can go, okay? And I would say misallocation is important. The quantity magnitude exactly varies quite a bit depending on the context and the method. But we really need to understand what's driving that misallocation and also what dynamic implications or what broader implications that has. The direct approach instead kind of provides more emphasis on exactly the measurement of the distortions directly and then assessing the quantitative impact of that. And so this may be done either through quasi-natural experiments or some reform or some event that allow us to separate what effects that particular institution or policy has. or through some sort of structural model and the measurement of these policies. So there are many examples: regulation or discretionary provisions, industrial policy, financial frictions, trade. I'm just going to mention a couple. I guess what I have, 10 minutes? Jim, about 10 minutes. Okay, let me mention a couple of these. So one very early example of this type of policies would be like firing cost. So this is an adjustment cost that is created by policy. So whatever dispersion in marginal product is generated should be attributed to misallocation. And these are interesting because it gives you an example of a policy that is not set up to affect any one particular business. These policies are generated to perhaps keep employment high. But by nature, it generates differential effects into expanding firms versus contracting firms. And this is why, even though the policy applies to all producers, it would differentially affect those firms that are expanding and contracting. So this generates what we call an inaction zone, and within that inaction zone, there will be dispersion in marginal products that very much will look like my example I showed you earlier. You will have both dispersion in marginal products within productivity types as well as across. Now, it turns out that when you put this in the context of a model, it will be similar to having like a benchmark economy that has no firing costs, and then you put firing costs. You can calculate both the dispersion in marginal products that is generated by this policy, that is somewhat easy to measure, and as well as the aggregate cost in terms of productivity. So when you look at these numbers, from firing costs, so a firing cost which is equivalent to 1 year wages, these are very common policies in European countries and Latin American countries. The TFP loss implied by that is 2%. So while 2% is something, it's kind of limited in terms of the big disparities I showed you earlier at the beginning. Now, if you have firing costs that are bigger, you get bigger losses, and it generates dispersion in TFPR that are larger. And so you can see that part of the reason why these effects are relatively small is that these type of policies don't generate a lot of dispersion, at least not as large as dispersion as what you get when you measure things in the indirect approach. So it has to be that there are other things that are creating dispersion. Now, I wanted to emphasize here one thing is that you get dispersion in TFPR. These policies also generate a correlation between the productivity of the establishment and the distortions they are facing, the TFPR, which is about 76%. So this is a feature of many, many policies that I'm going to come back to, because this type of correlation is what's essential for these dynamic implications of misallocation. The other one will be financial frictions. It's a very, very well-studied type of institution. Same thing. The institution may be common across all producers, but the high productivity producers who don't have capital, those are the ones who are going to be constrained in their operation. And that's what's going to drive the dispersion in the marginal product of capital. Now, the challenges that you see here involve, while now you have a better control in terms of what's driving the misallocation, and therefore you have direct policy recommendations, there are many policies that you want to study that are not easily available to direct measurement. And one issue is that what you find is that many things that distort allocation would not show up necessarily in the law, in the tax code, but they are really effective. So one example would be like a regulation that in principle should apply to all producers, but it's only enforced in the larger, more efficient producers. So it's really the effective wedges, not the law. And so that's why sometimes it's hard to really measure how these institutions or policies affect outcomes. Now, once you go to narrow to these specific policies, the other trade-off is that then we're talking about a small piece of the overall productivity gap. So what you need is many, many of these policies to interact together. Okay, and that makes things challenging. Now, there are some exceptions to these, which I'm going to skip because I'm running out of time. But basically, the big, where you find big effect from kind of a single institution or single policy will be something like the landmarking institutions in agriculture, related to the picture of Malawi I showed you earlier, When you go to these poor countries and you look at the land institutions, what you see is a very common pattern where the land market just doesn't function well. You have a combination of people are assigned use rights, but they don't have property rights over those rights, and it's hard for them to reallocate this resource to best use. Okay? So the pattern that emerges is very similar to what I showed you for Malawi, whether you look at it in China, whether you look at it in Ethiopia, many other contexts. The other thing is that when the other exception to this is that if instead of looking at the big variation in productivity across countries, you focus on the lower bar of understanding a particular change in an economy through, let's say, a reform. And so you may look at a land reform in a country and see how that reform contributed to the decline in productivity, or a trade reform, and then you can, and usually when it's done in this way, these direct attempts are way more successful in explaining the data. Okay. There's some nice pictures in that. Okay. So now let me then go to my last point, which is about kind of thinking about these broader consequences of misallocation. So to recap, kind of this early analysis that I just focused on takes the productivity distribution in the economy as given and then asks whether the resources that the economy has are allocated efficiently or not, and what is the consequence of that reallocation. Okay? Now, the interesting thing is that the literature has really moved beyond this more static sense of misallocation and start studying the implications, the dynamic implications. And this can be summarized as providing a connection between misallocation in the narrow sense I talked about earlier with selection or technology channels. Okay? So I'm going to try to make that connection explicit. Now, to see why this is important, it would be good to take a stock in terms of how much of the income differences or the productivity differences can be attributed to misallocation in this narrow sense, how much is selection and technology. And the point is that at the end of the day, misallocation is going to be a small piece of the overall productivity differences. So we need, for these policies to be really a contributor to productivity gaps, you need to provide that connection. And so the way I do this is that I take the parametric version of the model I showed you earlier, but then I combine it with micro and aggregate moments from CN Clino 2009 to kind of provide a perspective of these productivity gaps. So when you look at the TFP gain that results from eliminating the distortions either in China or India relative to the United States, basically you get a productivity increase of 60%, okay, in those experiments. Now, they argue with aggregate data on the manufacturing sector that this is about half the difference in TFP, okay? So from this perspective, this half is misallocation in their sense, and half will be something we don't know. Now, it turns out that only half of this, it's not apparent from when you do the exercise, but because they call everything misallocation, that's the data they have. But only half of it, you need more structure to do this separation, but only half of it arises when you keep the productivity distribution constant. So here, the counterfactual will be to keep the productivity distribution as in the US, and then put the distortions you see in China and India and see what the TFP gain will be in that case. Well, it turns out you get only half of the gain. The other half is because those distortions apply to a productivity distribution in China and India that is different from the US. Now, it's unclear whether you should attribute that to selection or to technology, maybe both. I'm going to attribute it here to selection just to give you the overall picture. So that decomposition will roughly say that misallocation, when you look at the manufacturing sector in these specific examples, misallocation will be like a quarter of the gap. Selection maybe a quarter of the gap or maybe less. And technology will be about a half. Okay? So obviously we need to, if we're going to think that these policies make a bite, we better connect misallocation to those two channels. Now it's pretty obvious that they're going to be connected. And throughout, I think I make this connection that the pattern of misallocation we get is one where you have both kind of dispersion within productivity types and across types. And there's a lot of reasons to see that that's going to generate dynamic implications. It may not be so important to whether the static misallocation is different or not. At the end of the day, for the static calculation, what matters is dispersion in marginal products, whether it's correlated or not. It's not going to be so critical. But for the dynamic implications, being correlated to productivity is going to be key. Because imagine that if distortions are increasing the productivity of the establishments, then that's like a lower return to being productive. So if you're undertaking investments, if you are, your incentives to adopt a better technology, they are going to be affected by that. Similarly for distortions, so if you're a very productive producer, but you're a good producer in other sectors perhaps, on other activities, and these distortions are lowering your return to being in that sector or in that activity. So you can see that misallocation and selection and technology are going to be related. So there are several articles that have emphasized this. So I'm just going to give you a few examples, and I'm almost done. So the financial friction is a very good one because, again, it's an institution that is described at the country level. Just the financial system is not well developed, hard to get credit to productive users. But the key is that this really affects the productive producers who don't have capital. And this affects this economy in two ways. One is misallocation in the standard sense that you described earlier, that these producers, if they operate, they're going to be producing at a lower scale, so their marginal product of capital is going to be high. But it may be that very productive producers who don't have capital decide to not operate and simply either be workers working in another sector. So that's going to distort the occupational choice of these, and therefore it's going to be attributed to selection. Similarly, you may have low productivity producers who have capital, who operate. Okay? And it's through that selection that when you look at this type of exercises, the big productivity gains or losses that are associated with misallocation are attributed to the selection component rather than just the static misallocation effect. The other example, which is very, very nice, are all the episodes of trade liberalizations when you study it empirically. They all feature this, not just reallocation of factors across producers when you have these trade restrictions and you remove them, but selection plays a big role quantitatively in all these studies. And even within firm growth plays a role, which is a notion of technology. And then I talk about this imperfect land market. So in the context of the agricultural, non-agricultural sector, the selection is pretty big. This exercise by Adamopoulos and co-authors, you go from a static misallocation gain of 80% to about a 15-fold when you take into account the selection effect. The connection for technology, there's many papers that can be described. So Bustos is a very nice empirical application because it basically studies a trade reform, free trade agreement in the countries in the Mercosur. And then she studies how these affected technology upgrading of firms in Argentina. And the evidence is very strong that these kind of the changes in the return in terms of these expanded export markets really incentivize firms to upgrade their technologies. There's a very nice paper by Stephen Earst. He's a graduate student in Toronto, and he will be on the market next year, so you should watch out for him. But he wrote a very beautiful paper where he connects misallocation to standard models of technology adoption. So he took the classical model of Parenti and Prescott of barriers to technology adoption, but he expanded it to allow for production heterogeneity and to bring in all the micro data that we have to think about or to discipline these restrictions. And in essence, what he shows is that these micro distortions act as an aggregate barrier to technology adoption. So a lot of the patterns we see in terms of technology diffusion and adoption can be reconciled just from the perspective of this misallocation. And then there are papers that focus on kind of productivity, investment, and firm dynamics. And I'll end with this. So when you think about the firm dynamics, one of the kind of striking pieces of evidence, and this was brought up by Sia and Clino, is that when you look at the life cycle of plants, it's a very different world when you look at the US, where plants start small and then they grow about a factor of 8 times in the manufacturing sector, versus something like Mexico, which is only an increase of 2-fold, or India, where basically firms start at some size and they just stay there. And so the productivity picture you get is very similar to this. And so the question is this connected to misallocation? So what they have in mind is a model where firms invest in their life cycle. And a key element is going to be this correlation of productivity to distortions, so that this correlation is going to be creating disincentives for firms to invest. Okay? Now, the picture here from Sia and Clino is that basically, if you take the US and you hammer them with the correlated distortions in India, basically productivity is going to drop by 25%. So it seems pretty big just from the life cycle of the firms. Now, the problem is that you need to embed this into a framework where you actually have the misallocation and everything else together, entry and everything else. Because that's kind of like a partial picture. And it turns out it's critical because when you have firms, if you look at the productivity distribution that would arise in like a cross-section where you go measure it, it will be very different in the US than in India. You will get much less dispersion in productivity. So firms in India, at least from the perspective of life cycle, will be all the same or closer to each other. While in the US, it will look very different depending whether they are old or young. And so that's kind of critical to kind of assess how important is the life cycle component. And so in a paper with Pedro Bento, sitting right here, former student of Toronto, we put all these factors into one framework that I think is, we solved it as a very tractable framework where we can study the effects of these different components, this static misallocation and these dynamic investments, but where we could separate the contribution of misallocation, the dynamic life cycle part, or just other investments. And so the picture that emerges is, I think, very interesting, and it kind of puts, give us some hints in terms of moving forward. The idea is that, so we started with an economy like the US, which was our benchmark. And so in this framework, there is going to be, it's going to be very much like the Sia and Clino framework, but you're going to have endogenous entry, so the number of firms is going to be endogenous, so firm size is going to be endogenous. And then there's going to be 2 types of investments. Firms invest when they enter into the market, so their productivity is not going to be the same everywhere. And then they're going to invest over the life cycle, so it's going to capture the Sia and Clino life cycle effect. So this is what you get when you move from the US, where it's basically there's some distortions, but the correlation of distortions to productivity is very low, to a place like India, where the correlation of productivity to distortions is very high. Okay? And what you get is that firm sizes are going to drop tremendously, and this is consistent with the evidence we actually constructed with Pedro on the establishment sizes across countries. So it roughly matches what India has. And then you're going to have an effect on the productivity of the firms that enter, very large one in terms of the entrant productivity. So it's going to be a drop in 58% in the productivity upon entry in the market. And then there's going to be a reduction in life cycle growth that kind of resembles the type of growth pattern we just saw from the Sia and Clino evidence. And so this is going to generate, then you can use this framework to kind of decompose the different components. And so what we do here is first kind of the static misallocation. And so this is a drop in productivity that is consistent with what we see in India from the micro data. So it's a substantial drop in productivity. And then you have a life cycle growth, which actually doesn't contribute much. And what happens here is that, as I said earlier, these flatter life cycle growth profiles, they have an effect on entry and on the productivity distribution that kind of reduces the impact of misallocation in some sense, okay? But if you attribute it to life cycle growth, as you should, then it just doesn't provide a large amplification. It just doesn't add to the income differences that you can explain with that. And instead, this intra-investment is more important because this is like a shift in distribution. It doesn't have the same compensating effects. those alternative effects. So you have, so this is like a shift in the mean of the distribution. And so this is basically a doubling of the misallocation effect. So what this suggests in terms of understanding the productivity gaps, at least across countries, you may be interested in the firm dynamics, just, very interesting firm dynamic for many reasons. But in terms of an amplification channel, it looks like the connection to technology or selection, at least from the perspective of this, the connection to technology, shift in technology are more likely to be more important than life cycle firm dynamics. Okay, so I end with here. So productivity is at the core of cross-country differences in aggregate economic outcomes. I actually skip over the issue that the same patterns of productivity being key arises when you go at a more disaggregate level. So if you look at within the agricultural sector, industry, productivity is going to be key. And in fact, it's also going to be key in terms of driving the economic structure you see. Poor countries allocating more resources in agriculture than rich countries, and the patterns of structural change. There's a strong connection between the two, and I kind of skip over that. But the same issue arises. Productivity is key for these aggregate outcomes. And so misallocation as a one potential channel is quantitatively important. Depending on whether you look at the direct approach, indirect approach, the setting, the magnitude will vary, but I think today the evidence for this being a channel that is important is overwhelming. Now, there's big challenges because it's not a single source of the misallocation. So it's not like development is not easy. You just don't go and say, reform this financial sector, everything will jump up. So there are challenges of that. But I think that this current work that tries to connect misallocation with this dynamic aspect is very promising, and the fact that now we have more panel data available is going to help discipline those channels even more. And so I think more work is needed to quantify these dynamic implications of misallocation, and hopefully I persuaded you that it may be worth working in this area. So thanks very much.